The final vote had already started when I felt the temperature in the chamber change. I am Daniel Foss, Junior Attaché to the Human Delegation at the Galactic Council, and I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened that day. I had sat through 412 sessions in that chamber. I had learned to read the room the way sailors learn to read a storm before it breaks, and on that day, with the vote counter climbing against us for the 11th time that year, I knew something was different. Not because the vote was close. It was never close. Humanity always lost. What was different was the silence beside me. Ambassador Laura Whitfield was not looking at the counter. She was looking at her hands, folded on the table in front of her, perfectly still. In 4 years of watching her work, I had never seen her hands be still during a vote. She always tapped one finger, a small habit, a tell that meant she was already 3 moves ahead, already drafting the next appeal, the next compromise, the next patient argument that might save us a fraction of what we were about to lose. That day her hands did not move at all. The resolution on the table was called, in the sterile language the Council loved, an equitable resource reallocation measure. What it actually did was strip humanity of veto authority over our own border systems and hand administrative control of the Halden Corridor, a string of jump lanes that 3 human colonies depended on for supply and trade, to the Drenari Assembly. The justification took 200 pages. The real reason fit in 1 sentence. The Drenari had been embarrassed in a trade dispute 40 years earlier, before humanity had even joined the Council, and someone had decided that we, the newest members, the ones with no old alliances and no old debts owed to us, were the cheapest way to make that embarrassment go away. I watched the vote tally rise. 51 members in favor, 6 abstained. We had 4 votes against us, including our own, and even our own veto had been quietly suspended for this session, under a procedural rule none of us had been told about until that morning. I looked at the delegates around the circular chamber, tall Calvex diplomats with their layered ceremonial collars, the compact silver-skinned Orson trade envoys, the towering patient Severnite elders who almost never spoke, and I realized that not one of them was looking at us. Not one. They had learned, over the years, that looking at humanity during these votes made them uncomfortable, so they had simply stopped doing it. We had become something to be managed, not something to be seen. The presiding officer, an aging Calvex named Thessa Vorn, read the final tally in a flat, procedural voice, the same voice she used for every resolution, whether it concerned a border dispute or a shipping tariff. To her, this was Tuesday. To us, it was the 4th time in 6 months that something belonging to human colonists had been quietly redistributed to keep an older, more established species content. I leaned toward Laura and whispered that we should request a formal review, the way we always did, the way that bought us nothing but always felt like doing something. She did not answer. She stood. The chamber did not go quiet because she stood. Delegates stood and sat throughout every session, requesting the floor, withdrawing requests, shuffling toward exits for private conversations. Standing meant nothing on its own. What made the chamber go quiet was the way she stood. Not with the tired, practiced motion of someone about to make another appeal. She stood the way a person stands when they have already decided something and no longer need the room's permission. Thessa Vorn, perhaps sensing the shift, offered the floor with a slight incline of her long neck, the gesture that meant proceed. Laura did not move to the podium. She did not raise her voice. She looked around that circular chamber, at 51 delegates who had just voted to take something from us because it was convenient, and she said one word: noted. Then she turned and walked toward the exit. I want to tell you that the chamber erupted, that there was shouting, that alarms sounded and delegates leapt from their seats. None of that happened. What happened was worse. What happened was confusion, real, visible confusion, spreading across 51 alien faces that had never once considered the possibility that humanity might simply stop asking. Thessa Vorn actually called after her, asking if the human delegation wished to submit a formal objection for the record. Laura did not turn around. She simply raised one hand, a small gesture, almost a wave, and kept walking. I followed her, because I did not know what else to do. Behind us I could hear the murmur starting, low voices in a dozen different languages, translators struggling to keep pace with alien confusion. Someone called out a procedural question about whether the human delegation intended to return for the afternoon session on tariff harmonization. Nobody answered them. Outside the chamber, in the long marble corridor that connected the assembly hall to the delegation offices, I finally caught up to her. I asked her what that meant. Noted. I asked her if we were filing a formal protest, if this was some new strategy, if I needed to prepare documents. She stopped walking and looked at me, and I remember thinking that I had never seen her look tired before. Not frustrated, not angry, just tired, the way you look after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally realizing that no one else was ever going to help you carry it. She told me that for 11 years, humanity had come to this chamber and asked to be treated fairly. She told me that in 11 years, every single request had been met with patience that cost us nothing and gained us less than that. She told me that patience, real patience, was supposed to be rewarded eventually, that the entire structure of this council rested on the promise that if you followed the rules long enough, if you contributed enough, if you stayed reasonable and diplomatic and endlessly accommodating, you would eventually be treated as an equal. She told me she no longer believed that promise was ever real. I asked what we were supposed to do instead. She did not answer right away. She looked past me, down the corridor, toward the transit lift that led to the diplomatic shuttle bay, the one every human delegate used to travel back to our ships. She told me to pack my office, all of it, everything that mattered, and nothing that did not. I laughed, actually laughed, a short nervous sound, because I thought she was making some kind of point, some rhetorical gesture meant to be reported back to council leadership as a warning. She did not laugh with me. She simply repeated it. Pack your office, Daniel. We are done here. I want you to understand that humanity had never walked out of a council session before. Not once. We had been outvoted, ignored, patronized, and quietly stripped of assets across a decade of membership, and every single time, we had stayed. We stayed because leaving felt like losing, and losing felt like something we could not afford, not as the newest species in a chamber full of civilizations that had been meeting in that hall for longer than our written history existed. But I followed her down that corridor anyway, because something in her voice told me this was not a threat, and it was not a performance. It was a decision, already made, already final, and I was simply the first person to be told about it. Behind us, through the heavy doors of the assembly chamber, I could still hear the confused murmur of 51 delegations trying to understand what had just happened, unaware that within 72 hours, every human voice in that council would go silent at once, and that silence would be the loudest thing the galaxy had heard in 100 years. 12 hours after Laura Whitfield said the word noted and walked out of that chamber, I received a message on a secure channel that had never once been used in the 4 years I had worked at the delegation. It was a single line, no signature, no formatting, the kind of message meant to be read once and understood completely. It told me to report to Shuttle Bay 7 within the hour, and to bring nothing that could not fit in a single case. I stood in my office for a long moment before I moved. I looked at the shelves of physical books I had collected from a dozen worlds, the framed commendation from my first successful trade negotiation, the small potted plant a Severnite colleague had given me as a gift for helping her draft a treaty clause 3 years earlier. I realized, standing there, that none of it mattered anymore, not in the way it had an hour before. I took the plant. I left everything else. When I reached the shuttle bay, I found 40 other humans already waiting, diplomats, translators, junior attaches like myself, trade liaisons who had spent years building relationships with alien counterparts across a dozen departments. Nobody was talking. There was no chaos, no shouting, no last-minute scrambling for forgotten items. Everyone moved with the same quiet, deliberate calm, as though we had all somehow received the same instructions at the same time, even though most of us had never met before that morning. I found Ethan Cole near the boarding ramp, a trade liaison I had known since our first posting, and I asked him what he understood about what was happening. He told me only what he had been told, which was almost nothing. A full withdrawal, effective immediately, coordinated across every human post in Council space. He said the order had come directly from the Human Council delegation leadership, backed by authorization from Earth itself, and that questions were not being answered, only instructions. I want to describe for you what a withdrawal like that actually looks like, because I do not think anyone outside of it understood, not for weeks, just how complete it was. Within 72 hours, every human ambassador, trade envoy, cultural liaison, and support staff member left every council-affiliated post across 1,000 worlds. Not most. Every single one. Translators who had spent a decade learning obscure alien dialects for the sole purpose of easing communication between species that distrusted each other simply did not show up for their shifts. Logistics coordinators, who had quietly managed almost 60% of interspecies cargo routes, because humans had proven remarkably good at solving supply chain problems no one else wanted to touch, vanished from their stations without a word of handover. I learned later that the council leadership did not even realize the scale of what was happening until nearly a full day after it began, because the withdrawal had been planned with the same patient, invisible discipline that Laura Whitfield had shown in that chamber. There had been no announcement, no ultimatum, no list of demands. Humanity did not ask for anything. We simply stopped showing up. My own departure took place aboard a mid-sized transport called the Aldergrove, one of perhaps 200 human vessels quietly recalling personnel from every corner of Council territory that same week. I sat near a viewport as we cleared the orbital lanes of the Council homeworld, watching the massive, ancient structure of the assembly station shrink behind us, its lights still burning, its corridors still full of alien delegates who had no idea, in that first hour, that the humans who had translated their disputes, mediated their grievances, and quietly absorbed the blame for 100 small failures across a decade were never coming back. The consequences did not take long to appear. Grace Bennett, a colony administrator I had corresponded with for years, sent me a message 3 days later from a mining settlement near the edge of what had been designated the Halden Corridor, the very jump lane system the Council had just handed to the Drenari Assembly. She told me that the automated shipping schedules, which had been coordinated for 8 years by a small human logistics team working out of a station near the corridor's entrance, had simply stopped updating. Cargo ships that depended on those schedules to avoid collision in the crowded lanes were forced to hold position, unable to safely proceed without the coordination that had quietly kept that entire region functioning. Within a week, an entire quarter of the corridor's traffic had backed up, stranded, waiting for a system that no longer had anyone running it. The Drenari, who had just been awarded administrative control of that very corridor, discovered within days that control meant nothing without the infrastructure to use it. They had never built their own coordination systems, because for years it had simply been easier to let the humans do it. Now they had authority over a resource they did not know how to operate. It was not only logistics. I began hearing reports, filtered through old friends who still had contacts inside the Council structure, describing a slow unraveling in dozens of small but essential functions across Council space. Human translators had been quietly doing far more than converting words from one language to another. They had been softening insults before they landed, catching misunderstandings before they became incidents, explaining cultural context that prevented small disputes from becoming larger ones. Without them, 3 separate trade negotiations between the Calvex and the Orson collapsed within the same week, each side accusing the other of intentional disrespect over misunderstandings that a human mediator would have caught and corrected in minutes. I remember sitting with Ethan Cole aboard the Aldergrove, reading these reports together, and neither of us feeling triumphant about it. There was no satisfaction in watching a system fail, even a system that had treated us unfairly for over a decade. What I felt instead was something closer to clarity. For years, I had believed that humanity's patience was a form of weakness, that our willingness to accommodate, to mediate, to quietly absorb the difficult and thankless work no other species wanted, was the price we paid for staying in the Council's good graces. I had believed that if we simply worked hard enough and stayed reasonable enough, respect would eventually follow. What I understood now, watching those reports come in, was that we had never been working toward respect at all. We had been working as unpaid infrastructure, essential and invisible, propping up a system that had never intended to reward us for it. Not every human agreed with the withdrawal, and I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. There were voices back on Earth, and even within our own delegation, who argued that walking away from the Council meant walking away from influence, from a seat at the table, however unfair that table had been. Nathan Price, a senior trade liaison who had spent almost 15 years building relationships across Council space, argued fiercely in a recorded session that I was shown weeks later, insisting that we were trading a difficult peace for an uncertain future, that no civilization survives by isolating itself from every other civilization around it. But Laura Whitfield, when she addressed the full withdrawal team aboard a coordination vessel 3 days after we left, gave an answer that stayed with me for the rest of that year. She said that we were not isolating ourselves. She said that isolation would mean cutting off every relationship we had built, every alliance, every trade partnership, every genuine friendship formed across species lines. What we were actually doing, she said, was refusing to keep funding a structure that had never valued those relationships as much as we had. She said there was a difference between walking away from the galaxy and walking away from a chamber that had mistaken our patience for permission. I did not fully understand what she meant until weeks later, when the first reports began arriving of smaller species, ones who had never held real power within the Council, quietly reaching out to human colonies directly, bypassing Council channels entirely, hoping to establish relationships that did not depend on the old structure at all. But that part of the story comes later. In those first 72 hours, all I understood was this. Every human post across Council space had gone dark at once, calmly, deliberately, without a single threat or demand. And across 1,000 worlds, systems that had quietly depended on us for years were beginning, one by one, to grind to a halt. I remember looking out the viewport of the Aldergrove as we made the final jump back toward human space, watching the stars stretch and blur, and thinking that for the first time in over a decade, I had no idea what the Council would look like the next time I saw it. I did not know then how completely it would fall apart in the months that followed, or how much of that collapse would come not from anything humanity did, but from everything the Council had never learned to do without us. By the time 3 months had passed since our withdrawal, I was no longer working from a Council office. I had been reassigned to a coordination post on Meridian Station, a human outpost near the border of what used to be neutral Council territory, and my job had changed from diplomat to something closer to an intelligence analyst, piecing together fragments of information smuggled out by contacts who still had reasons to talk to us. What those fragments described was a Council eating itself alive. For over a decade, humanity had occupied a strange position within that chamber. We were new, we were young, and every older species had, at one point or another, used us as a convenient target for grievances they could not safely direct at each other. If the Calvex were angry about a trade imbalance, it was easier to blame human colonies for undercutting prices than to confront the Orson directly, who had actual military weight behind their objections. If the Severnite elders wanted to punish someone for a border violation decades old, humanity, with no ancient allies and no old debts owed to us, made a far safer target than provoking a species with the power to retaliate. What none of them seemed to realize, in all those years of quietly using us as a pressure valve, was that we had also been absorbing tension that would otherwise have built up between them. The moment we left, that tension had nowhere else to go. Claire Bishop, a journalist who had covered Council affairs for almost as long as I had worked there, managed to get access to a recording of a session held 6 weeks after our departure, and she shared it with me under an agreement that I would not publish it until she gave permission. I have never forgotten what I heard in that recording. The session had been called to address the ongoing collapse of trade coordination across 3 major systems, the same systems humanity had quietly managed for years. Within the first 20 minutes, the discussion stopped being about logistics entirely. A Calvex delegate accused the Orson trade envoy of deliberately allowing the coordination failure to continue, suggesting it benefited Orson shipping interests. The Orson envoy responded by raising a decades-old dispute over a mining claim that had nothing to do with the current crisis, an old wound that had clearly never healed, only been buried under the more pressing business of managing humanity's presence in the chamber. Within the hour, 4 separate species were shouting accusations at each other in a session meant to solve a shipping problem, and Thessa Vorn, the presiding officer who had read our final vote tally in that flat procedural voice, was forced to suspend the session entirely. That was not an isolated incident. Claire told me that similar collapses were happening in session after session, old rivalries resurfacing everywhere the council turned, because for years those rivalries had been quietly managed by human mediators who understood, better than almost anyone else in that chamber, how to keep old grudges from boiling over into open conflict. We had been so good at that invisible work that no one had ever recognized how essential it was until we stopped doing it. I want to tell you about Henry Marsh, because his part of this story matters more than mine. Henry commanded the defense wing stationed near Corden Colony, one of 3 human settlements that had depended on the now-defunct coordination systems in the Halden Corridor. Corden was a modest colony, built around a promising mineral deposit and a farming operation that had taken almost a decade to become self-sufficient. It had never needed much of a military presence, because for years the Council's own conventions had, at least officially, protected member colonies from unauthorized incursion. 6 weeks after our withdrawal, a Drenari task force entered Corden's system without warning. I do not believe the Drenari command expected serious resistance. From what Claire later confirmed through her own contacts, their leadership had assumed that a colony recently stripped of council protection and abandoned by its diplomatic representatives would be an easy target, a way to seize valuable territory while the wider galaxy was still adjusting to humanity's absence. They likely believed that a species which had spent over a decade choosing patience and negotiation over confrontation would continue to choose the same path, even with no council left to appeal to. They were wrong, and the mistake cost them. Henry Marsh's forces did not send a warning. They did not attempt negotiation, because there was no longer a chamber to negotiate in, and no authority left to appeal to for protection. Within hours of detecting the incoming task force, Corden's defense fleet, small but well prepared, engaged the Drenari ships at the edge of the system and disabled their lead vessels before the task force had even completed its approach. The remaining ships withdrew within a day, having lost any advantage of surprise and any illusion that human colonies could now be treated as undefended territory. I remember reading the after-action report Henry sent to Meridian Station, and one line in particular stayed with me. He wrote that for years, humanity had restrained its military development because Council Convention discouraged unilateral defense buildups among member species, a rule everyone else had quietly ignored while we followed it closely, hoping our restraint would be recognized as good faith. He wrote that the moment we left the Council, that restraint no longer served any purpose, and Corden's defenses reflected preparations that had been underway, quietly, for the 18 months building up to our departure. That detail changed how I understood the entire withdrawal. This had not been a sudden decision made in anger after a single unfair vote. It had been the final step in a plan that had already been in motion long before Laura Whitfield stood up in that chamber and said the word "noted." The failed attack on Corden sent a message across council space far louder than anything spoken in the assembly hall ever could have. Species that had assumed humanity's withdrawal meant weakness were forced to reconsider. Species that had never respected our restrained diplomacy began to understand, for the first time, that restraint and weakness were not the same thing, and that we had simply chosen, for over a decade, not to show them the difference. Not every reaction to our withdrawal was hostile, and this part of the story matters just as much as the conflict at Corden. Within weeks of our departure, smaller species who had never held real influence within the Council, ones who had watched humanity absorb blame and unfair treatment for years without ever standing up to defend us, began reaching out through informal channels. I received one of the first of these messages myself, from a modest trading delegation representing the Ilvanar, a species with a small but growing presence near human border territory. They had never had the standing within the Council to challenge the older species who dominated every vote, and they told me, plainly, that they had watched humanity treated unfairly for years and had felt powerless to do anything about it. Olivia Grant, who had taken over coordination of these outreach efforts from Meridian Station, spent those first months building what would eventually become something far larger than a simple trade agreement. She met with representatives from a dozen smaller species, none of whom had significant power within the old council structure, all of whom had grown tired of watching a handful of ancient civilizations dictate terms to everyone else. What she found, in meeting after meeting, was a shared frustration that mirrored our own. These species had never been given real influence in the chamber either. They had simply been too small, too new, or too dependent on trade with the larger powers to risk open objection. I sat in on several of those early meetings, and what struck me most was how different the tone felt compared to anything I had experienced in the council chamber. There was no procedural language, no careful diplomatic phrasing designed to avoid offending an ancient power. There was simply an honest conversation about what fair cooperation could look like between species who had all, in different ways, been treated as lesser participants in a system built to serve a handful of dominant powers. Grace Bennett, still administering the mining colony near the Halden corridor, told me during one of our calls that she had begun receiving requests from independent traders who had once relied on council-regulated shipping lanes but now preferred dealing directly with human logistics coordinators, because human systems, even without the old infrastructure, still ran with a level of reliability that the newly fragmented council territories could no longer offer. She said something that stuck with me. She said the galaxy was starting to relearn something it had forgotten during all those years of using us. It was starting to remember that we were good at this, not because we were desperate to be useful, but because we cared about doing it well. By the fourth month, reports from inside the council painted a picture of an institution barely holding together. Thessa Vorn, according to Claire's sources, had been forced to suspend 3 separate sessions due to disputes escalating beyond her ability to control them. Trade volume across council-regulated space had dropped by nearly a third, largely due to the collapse of coordination systems that had never had a backup plan beyond humanity's quiet, consistent labor. 2 smaller species, emboldened by Olivia's outreach efforts, formally withdrew their own delegations from the council, citing a lack of confidence in an institution that could not function without relying on a single species to manage its internal conflicts. I remember standing on the observation deck of Meridian Station one evening, looking out at the distant lights of ships moving through territory that, only months earlier, had been firmly under council jurisdiction, and thinking about something Laura Whitfield had said to me back in that marble corridor, right after she told me to pack my office. She had said that we were not walking away from the galaxy, only from a chamber that had mistaken our patience for permission. Watching that chamber slowly come apart from the outside, I finally understood what she meant. We had never needed the council to have a place in the galaxy. We had simply believed, for over a decade, that a place in that chamber was the only kind of place worth having. Every failed session, every collapsed negotiation, every smaller species reaching out to build something new with us, instead of through the old structure, proved otherwise. But the council was not finished yet, and neither was its need for us. Within weeks, word reached Meridian Station that a delegation was being prepared, one authorized to travel directly into human space for the first time in the council's history, carrying a request that none of us, even after everything we had already seen, expected to hear so soon. The council delegation arrived at Meridian Station on a gray, unremarkable morning, and I remember thinking that it should have felt like a bigger moment than it did. For over a decade, humanity had traveled to the council. Now, for the first time since our species had joined that chamber, the council was traveling to us. Laura Whitfield asked me to be part of the reception team, along with Olivia Grant and Henry Marsh, and I understood immediately why she wanted that particular group in the room. I represented the years of quiet frustration inside the chamber itself. Olivia represented the new alliances forming outside the old structure entirely. Henry represented the fact that humanity was no longer a species anyone could threaten without consequence. Together, we were meant to show the delegation exactly what they were dealing with now. The delegation was smaller than I expected, only 4 representatives, led by Tessa Vorn herself. I had never seen her outside the assembly chamber before, and something about seeing her in an unfamiliar setting, standing in a modest meeting room aboard a human station instead of behind the elevated podium she had occupied for years, made her seem smaller than I remembered. Beside her stood a Calvex trade minister I recognized from earlier sessions, an Orson representative I had never met, and a younger Severnite aide who looked deeply uncomfortable throughout the entire meeting. Thessa began with formal language, the same careful diplomatic phrasing I had heard in 1,000 council sessions, expressing regret over what she called a misunderstanding regarding the recent resolution and an eagerness to discuss a path toward renewed cooperation. I watched Laura listen to all of it without interrupting, her expression calm, almost gentle, and I understood that she was letting Thessa finish precisely because she wanted the delegation to hear how hollow those words sounded now, spoken in a room where no one needed to pretend to be patient anymore. When Thessa finished, Laura asked a simple question. She asked what, specifically, the council was offering in exchange for humanity's return. The Calvex trade minister answered before Thessa could, clearly eager to move past pleasantries and into substance. He described a proposal to restore full voting rights, including veto authority, and offered a formal review of the resolution that had triggered our withdrawal, with the explicit possibility of reversing the transfer of the Halden corridor back to human administration. It was, on paper, more than we had ever been offered in a decade of membership. I watched Laura's face carefully while he spoke, and I saw no triumph there, no satisfaction at finally being offered what should have been ours from the beginning. What I saw instead was something closer to sadness. She asked her next question quietly. She asked whether this offer had been prepared because the council had come to genuinely value humanity's presence in the chamber, or because the council could no longer function without the systems we had quietly maintained for years. The room went silent. The young Severnite aide looked down at the table. The Orson representative shifted in her seat. It was Thessa Vorn who finally answered, and I give her credit for choosing honesty over another round of careful diplomatic phrasing. She admitted that trade volume across council territory had fallen by nearly 40% in the 5 months since our departure. She admitted that 3 formal disputes between member species remained unresolved because no mediator trusted by all parties could be found to replace the human liaisons who had once handled that work. She admitted that 2 smaller species had already withdrawn their delegations entirely, and that others were reportedly considering the same, drawn by what she described, with clear discomfort, as an emerging alternative coalition operating outside council jurisdiction. I watched Olivia Grant lean forward slightly at that last statement, and I knew exactly what was coming. Olivia explained, in plain and measured language, that the alternative coalition Thessa referred to was not a rumor. It was real, it was already functioning, and it now included formal partnerships with 11 independent species, none of whom held meaningful influence within the old council structure, all of whom had approached humanity directly, rather than waiting for an institution that had never protected their interests to change on its own. She described trade agreements built on direct negotiation rather than centralized council votes, defense cooperation based on mutual respect rather than one-sided restraint, and a growing network of shared infrastructure that no longer depended on any single chamber's approval to function. I watched the Calvex trade minister's expression shift as Olivia spoke, moving from polite attentiveness to something closer to genuine alarm. I understood why. For as long as the council had existed, its authority had rested on being the only structure capable of coordinating trade and diplomacy across so many different species. If a functioning alternative existed, one that did not require submitting to a chamber dominated by a handful of ancient powers, the entire foundation of the council's influence was at risk. Henry Marsh spoke next, and his contribution to that meeting was brief but unmistakable. He confirmed, without elaboration, that human colonies across the border territories had completed significant defense upgrades over the previous 6 months, and that any further attempts to test human resolve, whether through military incursion or economic pressure, would be met with the same response Cordon Colony had already demonstrated. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The Drenari incident had already traveled through every corner of council space, and everyone in that room understood exactly what he was reminding them of. Thessa Vorn sat quietly for a long moment after Henry finished speaking. When she spoke again, her voice had lost the flat, procedural tone I remembered from that final vote count. She asked, directly, what it would take to bring humanity back into the council. Laura's answer surprised even me, though in hindsight I should have expected it. She told Thessa that humanity was not interested in returning to the council as it currently existed. She said that we had spent over a decade proving our value to a chamber that had never once considered proving its value to us in return, and that going back to that same arrangement, even with restored voting rights, would only postpone the same problems rather than solve them. She said that any renewed relationship between humanity and the council would need to be built on entirely different terms that reflected genuine partnership rather than tolerance extended toward a useful but expendable member. She proposed, instead of rejoining the existing structure, a formal renegotiation of the council's foundational principles, one that would include not only humanity but every species in the new coalition Olivia had built, each with equal standing regardless of how long they had existed or how much military strength they carried. She made clear that this was not a threat or an ultimatum meant to punish the older powers. It was, she said, simply the only kind of chamber humanity was willing to be part of going forward. I watched the delegation absorb that proposal, and I could see, in the careful, measured silence that followed, just how much power had genuinely shifted in the 5 months since Laura Whitfield had said the word noted and walked out of that assembly hall. The council had come to us expecting to offer a generous concession and receive gratitude in return. Instead, they were being asked to fundamentally reimagine the very structure that had given them authority for centuries. Thessa Vorn did not agree to anything that day, and I did not expect her to. A decision of that scale would require consultation with dozens of other delegations, negotiations that would likely stretch on for months, arguments among the older powers who stood to lose the most influence under any equal partnership arrangement. But before the delegation departed Meridian Station, she said one more thing that stayed with me long after that meeting ended. She admitted quietly, almost as though the words cost her something to say, that the council had never seriously considered what humanity might build if we stopped trying to earn a place inside their chamber and instead started building a place of our own. She said the council had spent so many years assuming humanity needed them that no one had ever stopped to ask what would happen if that assumption turned out to be wrong. I watched her delegation board their shuttle and depart Meridian Station later that afternoon, and I remember standing beside Laura on the observation deck, watching their ship shrink against the stars, much the same way the council homeworld had shrunk behind us 5 months earlier. I asked her if she believed the council would actually agree to rebuild itself around equal partnership, or if this had simply been a delay tactic while they searched for another way to reclaim their old authority. She told me it did not matter either way. She said that for the first time since humanity had joined that chamber, we were no longer waiting on an answer from anyone. Whatever the council decided to do, the coalition Olivia had built would continue growing, the defenses Henry had prepared would continue standing, and the relationships humanity had built directly with dozens of smaller species, built on respect rather than convenience, would continue to matter regardless of what happened inside that old assembly hall. For the first time in over a decade, I realized humanity was no longer negotiating from a position of needing to be included. We were negotiating from a position of being needed, and that difference, small as it might have sounded in a diplomatic meeting room, was about to reshape the entire galaxy far more than any single vote in that chamber ever could. A year passed before the Council finally agreed to Laura Whitfield's proposal, and by the time that agreement was signed, the galaxy it applied to had already changed so much that the old chamber barely resembled the institution I had walked out of 12 months earlier. I want to tell you what those 12 months looked like, because the final agreement, as significant as it was, only made sense once you understood everything that had happened in the space between our departure and that final signature. The coalition Olivia Grant had begun building in those first uncertain weeks after our withdrawal had grown far beyond anyone's early expectations. What started as informal outreach to 11 smaller species had expanded, by the end of that year, into a formal partnership involving 23 distinct civilizations, ranging from tiny agricultural settlements barely large enough to be called a species presence, to mid-sized trading powers who had grown tired of watching a handful of ancient civilizations dictate terms inside the old council chamber. Olivia named it, somewhat modestly I always thought, the Meridian Compact, after the station where those early conversations had first taken place. The compact operated on principles that would have seemed radical inside the old council structure. Every member species held equal standing regardless of population, military strength, or the length of time they had existed as a spacefaring civilization. Trade agreements were negotiated directly between the parties involved, rather than filtered through a centralized authority with its own interests to protect. Disputes were mediated by rotating panels drawn from across the membership, rather than by a single dominant power deciding what counted as fair. It was slower in some ways than the old council had been, and I think that slowness was part of its strength. Nothing moved forward until every party involved genuinely agreed to it, rather than being outvoted into compliance by a majority that had never bothered to understand their concerns in the first place. Grace Bennett's mining colony became one of the busiest trade hubs along the old Halden corridor within that year, not because the corridor itself had been returned to human control, but because independent shippers increasingly preferred routing through compact-affiliated systems where coordination remained reliable, rather than through Drenari-administered territory that had never developed the infrastructure to manage it properly. I remember Grace telling me, during one of our calls near the end of that year, that colonies she had never even heard of before our withdrawal were now sending trade representatives to her settlement directly, hoping to establish relationships within the growing network rather than wait for the increasingly fractured council to sort out its own internal disputes. Henry Marsh's defense preparations, which had once seemed almost excessive to those of us accustomed to the council's restrained conventions, proved to be exactly the right decision at exactly the right time. Word of the failed attack on Corden Colony had traveled far enough that no other species attempted a similar test of human resolve during that entire year. More importantly, several compact member species, smaller civilizations who had never had the resources to build strong defenses of their own, began entering into mutual protection agreements with human colonies, trading resources and expertise for the kind of security they had never been able to provide for themselves. What began as humanity's own defensive preparation slowly became the foundation for a shared security arrangement that made every member of the compact safer than they had been under the old council's supposed protection. I spent much of that year working alongside Olivia, helping formalize agreements with new compact members, and I want to describe one meeting in particular because it captured something important about what we had built. A small species called the Varen, numbering perhaps 200,000 individuals across a single system, reached out to the compact roughly 8 months after our withdrawal. They had never held any real standing within the old council, considered too insignificant to merit serious attention in a chamber dominated by species with populations in the trillions. Their representative, an elder named Toril, told us during our first meeting that his people had spent generations being spoken over in every forum where their interests were discussed, never invited to negotiate, only informed after decisions affecting their territory had already been made by others. I remember watching Olivia listen to him with the same patient attention she gave every delegation, regardless of how small or influential they were, and I remember thinking about how differently that meeting would have unfolded inside the old council chamber, where a species as small as the Varan would never have been granted a formal session at all. By the end of that meeting, the Varan had become the 19th member of the Meridian Compact, with full voting standing equal to any other member, human colonies included. Terrell told us, before he departed, that it was the first time in his people's recorded history that another civilization had asked what they needed, rather than telling them what they would receive. I think about that meeting often, because I believe it captures the actual difference between what we walked away from and what we built afterward. The old council had never been built on genuine cooperation. It had been built on hierarchy dressed up in diplomatic language, a structure where older, more powerful species set the terms and everyone else learned to be grateful for whatever scraps of consideration they received. The compact, whatever its limitations, at least tried to be something different. Not everything about that year was smooth. I want to be honest about that too, because I think a story told without its difficulties is not really worth telling. Coordinating 23 independent species with different priorities, different governance structures, and different histories of conflict with one another was genuinely difficult work. There were disagreements over resource allocation that took months to resolve. There were 2 separate incidents where member species nearly came to open conflict over old border disputes that predated the compact entirely, and it took careful, patient mediation, much of it led by Laura Whitfield herself, to prevent those disputes from escalating further. Building something better than the old council did not mean building something perfect. It meant building something that was at least trying to be fair, and trying, it turned out, mattered enormously to species who had spent their entire history never being tried for at all. The council itself, meanwhile, continued its slow decline throughout that year. Thessa Vorn, according to reports that reached us through channels that had grown considerably more open since our withdrawal, spent months attempting to hold together a coalition of older species, increasingly unwilling to accept the kind of equal partnership Laura had proposed. The Calvex and Severnite delegations, who held the most influence within the old structure, resisted the idea of surrendering their dominant position for nearly 6 months, hoping that time and patience might convince humanity to return to the old arrangement instead. But time worked against them, not for them. Every month that passed saw more trade routed through compact territory, more disputes resolved through compact mediation, more smaller species quietly withdrawing their council delegations in favor of a structure that actually listened to them. It was the Orson, surprisingly, who finally broke the deadlock. Their representative, the same one who had accompanied Thessa Vorn to Meridian Station months earlier, argued before the full council assembly that continuing to resist equal partnership would only guarantee the council's irrelevance, while accepting it, however uncomfortable it felt for species accustomed to dominance, at least offered a path toward remaining meaningful in a galaxy that had clearly moved beyond tolerating the old hierarchy. The final agreement, signed almost exactly 1 year after Laura Whitfield walked out of that chamber, dissolved the old council structure entirely and replaced it with an expanded version of the Meridian Compact, incorporating every species willing to accept equal standing regardless of size, age, or military strength. Several of the oldest and most powerful species chose not to join at all, unwilling to surrender the influence they had held for centuries, and I think that was, in its own way, the right outcome. A partnership built on genuine equality was never going to include everyone, and I do not believe it needed to. I attended the signing ceremony aboard Meridian Station, the same place where Thessa Vorn had first admitted the council could no longer function without us. I stood near the back of the room, watching representatives from 41 species, some enormous, some barely larger than a single settlement, gather to formally establish something none of them could have built alone. Laura Whitfield gave a brief statement at the ceremony, far shorter than anything I had heard her say in all those years inside the old chamber. She said that for over a decade, humanity had believed that earning respect meant proving our usefulness, absorbing unfair treatment patiently, and trusting that fairness would eventually follow. She said we had learned, in the year since walking away from that belief, that respect was never something to be earned through endless patience. It was something you built, deliberately, alongside others willing to build it with you. I thought, standing there, about that first day, the vote tally rising against us for the 11th time that year, Laura's hands perfectly still on the table in front of her, the single word she had spoken before walking out of a chamber that had spent over a decade mistaking our patience for permission. The galaxy had spent generations wondering what would happen if humanity finally stopped accommodating a system that never intended to treat us as equals. For over a decade, we had never given them an answer, because we kept choosing patience instead. In the end, the answer turned out to be simpler than anyone expected. We did not destroy the old order. We did not seek revenge against those who had treated us unfairly. We simply stopped waiting for permission to matter, and built something better instead, standing beside every other species who had been waiting just as long for someone to finally ask what fairness might actually look like. They had spent a century wondering what humans would do if pushed too far. We never told them. We simply walked away and let them discover, in our absence, exactly how much of their world we had been quietly holding together all along.